Yes, we're ready to go.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to go ahead and call the meeting of the Bloomington the Bloomington Liquor Commission to order. Thank you. At this point, Madam Clerk, would you call the roll?
Commissioner Jordan,
Yes.
Commissioner Paul, Commissioner Renner.
Here, thank you very much. At this point, we're going to start then with public comment. And we do have, you said 4 people, is that correct?
Yes, we have 4 people.
Public comment that want to speak on something that is not relevant or that is not directly related to what we're hearing today. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Mayor,
yes.
if I might, I want to make a statement about one of the items on the agenda. So if people are here or attending via Zoom for this item, they'll know that the hearing is not going to be happening.
Okay.
That is for the Western Tap. They agreed to settle their case
Okay.
for an $800 fine and without a hearing before the commission.
Okay. Thank you
So
very much.
that has been done.
Okay. Thank you. And then obviously anybody who would be speaking, they in the general public comment it should not be related to Western Tap or the Joe's Pub case. Okay. Madam Clerk, go ahead.
Thank you. For anyone has called in, just a reminder, you need to press *6 when your name is called to unmute. We're going to start with Christian Graham.
Thank you. I take it my
Yeah,
3
okay.
minutes starts now.
Sure.
Yes.
Yes. Go ahead.
And first wanted to thank the commission and Mr. Mayor. I enjoyed our conversation on Facebook the other day. I'm glad to see that you're doing well and you made it out of your non-quarantine quarantine. Would have happily delivered you food pursuant to the offer. I probably would have gotten it from Joe's because I'm avid supporter of any place that's staying open in the light of this tyranny. I would respectfully ask you to consider your own ordinance that spells out powers and duties, specifically Chapter 6, Section 37 E, where it gets into fine and or suspension of liquor licenses. I'm unaware of any statutes or Illinois regulations that any of the open businesses have been violating. They all seem to be very safety-minded and insist on mask wearing and distancing. I understand that the emergency rule requires mask wearing and distancing, and I understand that to be a regulation that the Liquor Commission could potentially enforce, but I really don't understand how you intend to go after these people. To the extent that you're successful, I applaud the commitment to education, although I'm concerned that many City of Bloomington Unit 5 residents are missing out on your redistribution. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it very much. Next.
Next, we'll move to Eric Harapy. I apologize if I mispronounced your name. But if you can press *6.
Eric?
Yep.
Yes, it's Jerpy, by the way, but that's okay. You're not the first person to mispronounce it. So I just have some general comments in regards to the shutdown, specifically here in Bloomington, but also across the country. As we all know, well, I'm a CPA here in Bloomington, and I have clients all over the country. So I see the effects that these shutdowns are having on not just the business owners, but their staff. And I have to say that it's atrocious. The business owners themselves may be okay, but there's the staff that rely on the businesses for them to pay their bills, for them to not be able to open. It's not right. And I want a couple of things as far as the COVID goes. So there's the 6 of the largest states right now. 2 of them are open, Florida and Texas. 4 are on shutdowns, California, Illinois, New York, and Pennsylvania. And the average 7-day rate is lower in the 2 states that are open. So I don't know where the science is behind where these orders are coming from. And if it is, please show the businesses where it's coming from. Because the businesses I know that are trying to stay open and follow the rules that were set as far as protecting the customers and protecting their staff, they're being followed. And if we don't stop these 1 in 4 small businesses are gonna close in the next 6 months. And I'll end on this. In many of these places that were locked down completely, the politicians are not following the rules themselves. Governor Newsom in California, Nancy Pelosi, I could go local, but I won't. It's the rules for thee, but not for me, and that's not fair. And I'll end it at that.
Thank you very much, Eric. Madam Clerk.
It looks like we lost a few, so the last person we'll have to speak for general public comment is Mr. Grant Jones. Mr. Jones, if you can press *6, you'll have 3 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Grant.
Thanks for letting me speak. First off, I'd like to start by showing my full support for Joe's Pub. I agree with them trying to make a living to support their families, their employees, and their employees' families. I never thought I would see the day that our government that we pay taxes to, we pay fees to, would be our biggest enemy and roadblock to making a living. I don't understand how the city of Bloomington can try and enforce a shutdown of an entire industry without giving any grants or financial assistance to this group of people. It is an outright attack on people and businesses with liquor licenses. What confuses me the most is the unfair treatment of different types of establishments in town. Perfect example of this happened the other day. I was driving down Oakland and decided to go into Denny's for breakfast. I walked inside, I sat inside, I ordered inside, and I ate inside. I did not contract COVID, and I felt safe eating indoors. I have not seen any punishment or attack on their right to be open or make a living. I would like to know the difference between Joe's Pub and Denny's. I've seen other examples of unfair treatment to different types of establishments as well. Every day I see people going into Target, they shop, they wait in line to check out, they even wait in line at the indoor Starbucks to get their coffee. Yet no one is allowed into Joe's Pub to wait in line or order a coffee. I don't understand the unfairness and unequal treatment of these 2 types of establishments when they are both providing a drink and a service. What is the difference between enjoying a cup of coffee inside the Starbucks at Target and enjoying a cup of coffee inside at Joe's Pub? Finally, I would like to thank State Senator Jason Barrickman. He came out to Joe's Pub this morning for the rally and threw his support behind Joe's Pub. It was great to see a group of people supporting each other in the community and coming together for the right to work. I will have to say I was extremely disheartened that I didn't see any council members, including my own Ward 3 member, show up today to support this local establishment. To me, it seems clear that this is an attack on small business while these people are just trying to survive and pay their bills. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anything else, Madam Clerk?
We did have 2 people join while Mr. Jones was speaking that registered both for general public comment and for Joe's Pub to be a witness. So we can ask them if they would like to make their public comment for general public comment, if that's okay with you.
Sure. Just one clarification. We would not normally go back and forth in terms of public comment, but there is a real clear difference between, and we really shouldn't even be talking about the details of this. It's kind of out of order, but Joe's Pub and Denny's, the one thing is, it's a structural thing. Denny's doesn't have a liquor license. Denny's, we have as a city, Mr. Wargo, That's the way the laws are written. That does, regardless of what it is. The health department is supposed to be responsible for administering any of the public safety rules with institutions that do not, or establishments that do not have liquor licenses. We have no actual role or responsibility as a city if there are no liquor licenses. So, Madam Clerk, if you could go ahead and call the two people, if they've joined us and they're
Excuse me,
willing
Mayor.
to, we'll go forward. Yes.
Excuse me, Mayor, I was wondering if you could check with Ms. Jimenez, I believe, is on, and she may have some thoughts. I would suggest that if they're going to be addressing Joe's and they're called as witnesses by Mr. DeVore, that should be in the Joe's part of the hearing.
Okay.
If they're going to be making a general public comment, and I suppose, they can mention Joe's, but anything that's going to be testimony in terms
Sure.
of facts or anything like that should probably be in the hearing. And I'm
Correct.
open to hearing other points of view on that.
Angela, is that you want any weigh in?
I
on
would just say in the Cliff Notes version on that, if they're making a general public comment, they can make a comment now. Otherwise, if they're discussing specifically the case in front of you, Joe's, then it needs to happen via the two counsel after witness testimony.
Thank you. So that would be, to the people that are online, if you just keep your comments general. If you specifically want to mention something about Joe's Pub and you're testifying, that's a separate matter. Madam Clerk, go ahead.
Okay, we've got a Mr. Nathan Draco. Mr. Nathan, if you could press *6 to unmute, you'll have 3 minutes.
Hello, thanks. Sorry about a little bit of confusion. I had to transition from a work phone to a cell phone, and I appreciate the clarity on the public comment versus the specific case, and I'll keep it very general. Short stint in Indiana, and as I've traveled, as we've all made sacrifices during this pandemic and seen changes and seen the different ways that states and local governments have handled it, I think the frustration, the general theme here is it feels like we're picking winners and losers. And I had, admittedly, I didn't understand the liquor license or the liquor commission versus the public health, but that comment stood out to me. Like if our public health department isn't enforcing any type of regulations on those type of restaurants that don't have a liquor license, then I guess I'll leave it at general statement or comment would be, how come we're not going to bat? How come you guys as a liquor commission aren't going to bat for the rights of our small businesses here to try to maintain in this second round of, I feel like we all practiced all the regulatory actions we needed to and CDC guidelines, the first round of this, March for an extended period. And then we finally got a little light at the end of the tunnel and felt like we could see some bounce back. And outside of this specific issue, we're dealing with enough as the state of Illinois and people leaving the state and the guidelines that we're trying to live under. And it just feels like we all should be in favor of small business that follows the regulations and the guidelines that, if patrons want to go participate in activities there and are going to maintain those policies and rules, that it should be allowed to do it. And I wish that my hope would be that our local government here, you guys as the council, would be trying to go to bat for that versus, enforcing maybe complaints or other things that seem to be far-fetched and targeting, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Very much appreciate that. Continue, Madam Clerk.
Our last public commenter we have online is Michael Reginelli. Mr. Reginelli, if you can press *6, you'll have 3 minutes.
I might have clicked the wrong button. I was hoping to testify on behalf of Joe's. Could I get slated under item 4? Is that possible?
Mr. Regineldi, is that correct?
Yes,
Pronounce your name?
Yes, sir.
If you'll stay online, I will be asking for people who are either in favor or against as we get to the Joe's Pub case. So
sure.
If you just stay with us, that would be the most appropriate, use of our time. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate that. At this point, we're going to go ahead and go forward with the,
Excuse me, Commissioner Renner.
oh, yes,
I just
sure,
want to announce the one person who did register for public comment, but then
Oh,
was not
yes.
available.
please.
Mr. John Reed, he registered but is not present.
Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate that. We're going to move on to our complaint violation 2020-31 at Joe's Pub at 3907 GE Road in Unit 2 in Bloomington. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to, well, at this point, I would ask, I understand you have legal counsel, the Joe's Pub has legal counsel, and I'm assuming, is this correct, Angela? I would start with legal counsel and let them make their case. Is that correct, right?
Yes, you'd have them do their opening and then they can make their case.
Okay, we're going to start with the opening
Can I
statement.
get a little explanation under that as to why we would have to present a case when you're presenting a case against?
Hey,
I think there may be a misunderstanding.
Whoa. Okay, George, Mr. Boyle, go ahead.
I
sorry,
think there may
Mr.
be-
Renner. Anthony, talking.
I think-
Whoa, Mr. Boyle.
I think there may be a misunderstanding, and Ms. Fiancementis can clarify this if I'm wrong. But we are the party with the burden of proof,
Right.
that being the city. So we would go first,
You
then
go,
the
okay.
defense would go second, and then we would have an opportunity for rebuttal.
Okay, thank you. Then Mr. Boyle, I will, Angela, is that correct? Just to clarify.
Yes, that's correct, what George is saying.
I apologize then. Mr. Boyle, you go first.
Thank you, Mayor.
Mr. Mayor, are we going to have opening statements or are we going to go right to evidence?
Mr. DeVore, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
but my thought would be that we'd have a brief opening statement,
Yes.
and then.
That's, okay.
I would-
Well, that's fine. That's what
And then
we'll
I
do.
think we have very limited facts, and we could perhaps agree to those, and then we could make our arguments.
So, Mr. Boyle, that's fine. Just go ahead, Mr. Boyle. You go first, and then we'll have brief opening statements, and we'll go forward. Again, the order in this is not going to matter. Thank you, Mr. Boyle.
Thank you, Mayor. I realize that some of these regulations and some of the arguments that may be heard this afternoon can seem arcane, can seem hard to understand and to get your arms around. But essentially, it comes down to this. Our liquor code prohibits all licensees from ignoring valid state laws. Very simply, our code requires all licensees to follow the law and to comply with all codes and regulations pertaining to health and safety. The governor's emergency orders prohibiting the indoor on-premises consumption of alcohol, issued pursuant to his express authority under the Illinois Emergency Management Act, are valid regulations pertaining to health and safety. There's part of the act that specifically gives him the power during a disaster proclamation to prohibit or to limit the sale of alcohol on premises. That's section 7, sub 9 of the act. So that's perhaps the most specific, but there are some others I could get to in a moment. This involves a licensed business that violated that prohibition, and it has been brought before the Liquor Commission due to the violation. Very specifically, Mr. Graham had asked a little bit about this earlier. Chapter 6, Section 37E3 provides that the commissioner can sanction licensees for permitting a violation of state law or Bloomington City Code on the licensed premises. Chapter 43 of our code incorporates state law and regulations pertaining to the sale of liquor into our ordinance. Specifically, any rules of the State Liquor Control Commission. Similar to our code, the State Liquor Commission has a rule 100.30A3, that states that no license holder shall suffer or permit a violation of any federal or state law or any rule of the commission on the premises. we have an additional provision, Chapter 6, Section 37E4, that very specifically requires licensees to comply with all regulations pertaining, laws and regulations pertaining to health and safety. So on March 9th, the governor issued a proclamation under Section 7 of the Illinois Emergency Management Act. On that date, when the COVID-19 pandemic was declared a disaster in the state of Illinois, there were 11 confirmed cases of COVID-19. The governor has entered several proclamations since that time and several executive orders since that time as the pandemic has worsened. Those regulations have been upheld without exception by Illinois courts, most recent being the case of Foxfire Tavern versus Pritzker, a 2020 Illinois appellate court case. I believe the number is 60023, decided on November 13th of this year. With regard to the Illinois Emergency Management Act, that act in several sections, but particularly in sections 6 and 7, give the governor the authority, once a disaster is proclaimed, to do certain things to remedy the pandemic, and consequently also require certain units of government, such as the city, to cooperate and to enforce those orders. Specifically, with respect to the units of government, I'm referring to Illinois Emergency Management Act, Section 7, Sub 2. As I mentioned before, there are several sections, but specifically Section 7-9, that states that the governor may regulate, limit or limit the sale of alcohol on premises. That's what's being done here through the November 13th executive order that prohibits on-premises indoor consumption. When the governor proclaimed that, he was citing hundreds of thousands dead in Illinois. I'm sorry, hundreds of thousands of, COVID persons suffering from Illinois. And we had lost, as of yesterday, over 14,000 Illinoisans due to the disease. I think the facts are clear, and perhaps Mr. DeVore may agree to just stipulate to them. He said he wouldn't have a problem with our Exhibit 8, which has the police report on it. But the facts are clear that on November 28th, 2020, at approximately 4:45 p.m., the licensee violated Chapter 6, Section 37E3 and E4 of our code, the ones that require compliance with state laws and with health and safety regulations, by violating the prohibition on indoor on-premises consumption. And that prohibition comes from Executive Orders 69 and 73, and those orders that have continued them. At this point, I don't know if Mr. DeVore does want to just stipulate to the facts and go on to argument or to the sentencing portion. However, I'm fine with either one of those. If not, I would call our officer. Perhaps what we'll do is I could call our officer.
With all due respect to my colleague, Mr. Mayor, would it be okay if the respondent makes an opening statement, or is that just irrelevant?
You will get that, or you will get that chance. Mr. Boyle, you can finish.
What I'll do is part of our case in chief is to move for admission of all of our exhibits.
Okay.
And so that's moved, and I'd like a ruling on that. That would include Exhibit 8, which is the police report.
Okay. Is there, no, in this sense, Mr. DeVore, do you have any objection to admitting any of those pieces of evidence?
Well, I have to say, I've done hundreds of hearings across this state.
Mr. DeVore, you will get the chance to make your statement. Do you object to any of the?
Do I get a chance to talk at all, Mr. Mayor? Are you going to get interrupted me every time, sir?
Only if you're moving to an opening statement. I'm asking a very simple declarative statement, Mr. DeVore. Are you?
And I'm trying to answer the question without giving an opening statement, Mr. Mayor, if you'll let me, please.
Okay, go ahead. Are you accepting?
Of all of these things offered as exhibits, only one of them is an exhibit. The rest of them are merely legal authority that's going to be used. So offering it as an admission as an exhibit doesn't even make any sense. To that extent, all of them except for Exhibit 8, which is the police report, it's not even a question of admission or not. They're merely going to be referred to as legal authority.
Okay.
So that's fine. But as to Exhibit 8, I would like the police officer to be put on as it relates to that one.
Okay. All right. Mr. Boyle, that should be fairly clear.
Yeah, we have no problem with that. We understand that the first,
Sure.
that probably 8 out of the 9 exhibits, we've called exhibits simply to keep track of them.
Sure.
More easily than some of the longer names.
Okay.
That those are, not necessarily evidentiary facts. That Exhibit 8 is the one that is a fact. My understanding was there was going to be.
I think we're all okay with that. It sounds like we're good. Okay, Mr. DeVore, your opening statement.
Thank you, sir. Here. The gentleman that I want to say that 90% of what the opening statement was of the Liquor Commission is not even relevant. One of the statements made before by one of the general comments about the confusion as to why places without liquor licenses are not being having their indoor premises closed, but liquor license holders are, and that confusion is quite simple. This is a health regulation issue. Whether or not a premises should be made off limits to the public to potentially prevent the spread of a disease is a health issue. The health department of your county, for its own reasons, has chosen not to pursue that. And so we merely have within the city of Bloomington utilization of a liquor license as a tool to try to force closure of a business premises. That's the difference. The governor's executive order, even though I don't think it's relevant to this, it's not a law. If you read, it says all restaurants and bars must close. All restaurants and bars must suspend indoor on-premises consumption. There is nothing in that executive order relegated to the regulation of alcohol, as was suggested by Mr. Boyle, has nothing to do with that. The purpose of the governor's executive order, for whatever it's worth, is to try to keep people out of the inside of a premise. They don't care why. As it relates to bars and restaurants, whether they're drinking a cup of water or whether they're eating anything or whether they're consuming alcohol, it has nothing to do with any of that. Let's be clear. This is a liquor license suspension hearing for one purpose and one purpose only, is to coerce these business owners to shut their indoor premises down. What is an executive order? I'm reading is these license holders must comply with codes and regulations pertaining to health and safety. That's what it says. And it gives some examples. It's not exclusive, as we know, it's not an exhaustive list. but it talks about the McLean County Health ordinances and regulations of the McLean County Health Department. This is not a liquor license hearing about the regulations of the health department at the state or at the county level. We have this ruse being created that in executive order is health regulation. This will be the first city in the state of Illinois. Now, the case that's being talked about, the Foxfire case in the 2nd District, has nothing to do with the hearing that's in front of this commission. That case had to do with the governor's ability to promulgate an executive order to create it. Can he do it after 30 days or not? That's what that case was about. The governor is not in this case. This is a case about whether a city license can be suspended, revoked, or fined for having indoor dining, indoor consumption of something. It's all about whether a person can walk inside that building and sit down, is what we're talking about. And can this body, not the governor of the state of Illinois, can this body force that to happen by licensure? So that case in the 2nd District has nothing to do with this. We can accept the governor's executive order for whatever it is. Doesn't mean anything. Health regulations of this state are clear what it must happen in order to keep people out of a building. You know why the McLean County Health Department hasn't done that? Like almost every other county health department in the state of Illinois? Because they can't prove there's anything going on inside that premise. No more than this commission can prove there's anything going on inside that premise as it relates to a health risk. This is a jurisdictional thing that's completely relegated to the health department for them to do. And just because this city's frustrated that it doesn't think the health department's doing its job, you can't make a liquor license ruse. Now, again, I already know what the facts is going to be in this case. I think Mr. Boyle has been pretty straight with that. My client had something going on inside his premises, and that's a violation of a regulation that can be enforced by this commission, and that regulation being a governor's executive order. That's what we're going to hear, again, for the first time I've ever had to deal with this. I'm going to point you, Mr. Mayor, to a few things. I'm going to point you to two things that make this case conclusive. Sir, apologize, Mr. Mayor. There's going to be two things I'm going to point out to you, Mr. Mayor, that makes it unequivocal that you cannot take action against this license. Unequivocal. The first is a health regulation. What is a health regulation? I've given you a copy of a case that clearly lays out that a regulation is a specific administrative rulemaking function of the State Department of Health. They create regulations as it relates to health, and only them. And it goes through a specific public process. We all know we have the emergency regulation as it relates to the masks and the capacity limits. This commission has enforced that. That is a regulation enforced on.
Your Honor, Mayor, I'm going to ask Council DeVore. This is Deputy Corporation Counsel Finance Menace. I'm advising the mayor on this. It sounds in your opening that you're stipulating to some of the facts that occurred, that this may be just legal argument as to whether the city liquor commission can enforce. Can't hear you.
With all due respect, counsel, I just listened to 90% of that coming from Mr. Boyle.
No, I understand. I'm just trying to see if there's any issue with the facts that are in this case. If this is just mostly legal argument on both sides. I'm sorry, your internet cut in and out.
There are going to be some
facts in dispute. Okay.
Apologies.
I'm sorry, Mr. DeVore, I couldn't quite hear you. Could you say that again, please? I think we're having some transmission issues here, Mr. DeVore. Are you there?
Yeah, the transmission. Yes, can you hear me, sir, Mr.?
You're cutting in and out, hello? Mr. DeVore. Hello?
You're,
Angela, can you hear?
No, I can't. He keeps stalling.
Yeah, you keep coming in and out. I'm sorry, Mr. DeBoer. Madam
I
Clerk.
apologize, sir. Is that it?
We got you there for a second. Sorry.
Sorry, Mayor. Is it coming in and out still?
Gotcha now.
Sorry, sir.
Sure, go ahead.
And again, most of this case, I agree with counsel, will be legal argument. George threw a lot of it in at the front, and I'm trying to throw it in too, so when the mayor hears the facts, he can apply that to it. But this issue of a regulation, Mr. Mayor, I've laid out, and I'm going to show, and again, the case law is clear, what is a health and safety regulation? Who adopts those? Department of Health adopts those. But let's take it a step further, and let's at least give this fiction of the governor making a rule that you would have the ability to enforce. Let's just play with that and tease it for a second. If you go to the Emergency Management Agency Act, Section 6, it says the governor can make lawful necessary orders, rules, and regulations. He has the ability to make those. Now, how broad can he make those? And could he in fact create a regulation that you could enforce? We don't have to have that conversation, Mr. Mayor, because the fact of the matter is the governor has never, ever adopted a regulation. An executive order is a specific separate item. He can make orders, rules, and regulations. He's made executive orders. That's not even a regulation under the Emergency Management Agency Act, sir. And so when we're done today, when we get through a little bit of the facts, this body has no jurisdiction to impede the Department of Health's authority to make a premises off limits to the public. It's their jurisdiction only. To the extent this commission disagrees with that proposition and thinks that it can, enforce a governor's regulation and disregard the Department of Health, we don't even have to have that conversation, sir, because a regulation has never been adopted by Governor Pritzker. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we've had our opening statements. At this point, Mr. Boyle, do you want to bring someone forward or in terms of witness?
Here, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. You're good.
Call Officer Arjuna.
No, you're good. You're good. You're unmuted.
Officer?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, thanks. You can hear us?
Yes, sir.
Thanks, officer. Mr. Boyle, go ahead.
Well, first of all, Officer, I'm going to call your attention to a report, McLean County Incident Report.
No, stop this quick, Mayor. You have to swear him in, or the clerk.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Madam Clerk, would you please swear the officer?
Thank you, counsel.
Thanks. Madam Clerk.
Officer, please raise your right hand. Do you swear affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, ma'am.
Officer Arjuna, did you have occasion to visit the licensed premises on November 28th of this year?
Yes, sir.
About what time was that?
About 4:45 in the afternoon.
I'm going to call your attention to McLean County Incident Reports 2020-14889. Did you make an incident report, and is that the one that you made when you visited the establishment? After
Yes,
visiting
it
the
was.
establishment. What did you see in there with regard to persons consuming on premises? Did you see that or not?
When we arrived to Joe's, we saw people actively eating and drinking inside the premises. Most people were lined up at the bar drinking. They had a few that were eating as well. All Joe's staff were wearing masks, and all customers had a mask available to them. But at the time, they were all mostly actively eating and drinking.
So it's fair to say there are people on the premises, but that insofar as the face covering rules go with regard to the employees and so on, those were being complied with.
Yes.
I have no further questions.
May I inquire, Mr.
Sorry,
Mayor?
Mr. DeVore, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself.
No
Go
problem.
ahead. You have the floor.
Officer, the date was November 28th, 2020. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
Were you a trainee at that time or actually a law enforcement officer?
I'm a sworn law enforcement officer. I am in the FTO training process for the Bloomington Police Department.
Okay, and how long had you been working for this particular law enforcement agency on or about November 28th?
I was hired back in May and I was working on the street for about a month at that point.
You'd been an officer for about a month at this point, is that correct?
Yes.
On the street?
Yes.
Now, reading your report, I'm reading your report.
I'm sorry, your connection cut out, so I didn't hear anything.
Mr. DeVore, yeah, I couldn't hear your question either, Mr. DeVore. Go ahead. Please repeat.
Sorry about that. You said there were persons inside Joe's Pub eating, correct?
Yes.
How many?
It only appeared approximately 3 or 4 were eating, but everyone.
How many people were in the building?
How many people were in the building? There was approximately 10 to 12.
Okay. Do you know how many were employees and how many were patrons?
Yes. So I didn't include the employees in that count of 10 to 12. There are about 10 to 12 customers. And then I saw at least 2 employees that were working behind the bar at that time.
Do you know the employees of this establishment?
I do
personally?
not. I do not.
So how were you able to distinguish who was a patron and who was an employee? Were you just guessing?
The employees came up to us because they saw us in full department uniform to ask what we were doing there, and we explained we were doing a compliance check.
Okay, and when you came in, when you come in the door, how far did you go in? Did you stop at the door? Did you go all the way in? What did you do?
We went in about 5 feet inside the door. We observed everybody, and then the employee came and met us.
So 5 feet in the door. Is this a big place? I've never been in there, officer.
It's not that big of a place. You can see almost the entire inside establishment minus the kitchen area.
Okay. So coming back when it came in the door, you saw approximately 10 to 12 people that you believe to be patrons. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
And approximately how many were at the bar and how many were sitting? Do you have any recollection?
There was a table of 3 towards the back wall, and then everyone else was sitting on the bar.
And how far away from the bar were you?
No more than 10 feet, 10 to 15 feet.
And the people that were sitting at the table, how far away were they?
20, 25 feet.
Were people that were at the bar, did they have their backs to you?
Yes, most of them had their backs to us. We were able to see this. We were able to see the side of almost everybody at the bar, but we were able to see everybody sitting at the bar.
I don't understand. When you came in the door, where is the bar in relation to where you're standing? Is it in front of you, off to the left, off to the right?
So when you enter the door to Joe's, the bar is off to the right. They actually have a little gaming station, and then there's off to the far right. They have booths lining the far left wall, and then the bar is on that right wall, and it extends almost the entire length of the wall.
Okay. And you didn't leave when the employees approached you, you stayed right there. You didn't go in any further, correct?
Yes, we explained we were there doing a compliance check. The employees understood, and the employees stated that they called Mr. Wargo, the owner, and he was gonna come speak to us, and he eventually did come to speak to us.
Okay. And when you went in there and you talked to them, and you were doing a compliance check, what was the check? What were you checking for compliance on?
We were checking to make sure there was no indoor dining, because we had previous calls for our drawers for the exactly same reason. So we got called out there again to do a compliance check, and that's when we observed everyone inside actively eating and drinking.
Okay. And so, of the people at the bar, again, was your testimony that their backs were to you approximately 10 feet away?
Yes, so the way the bar is shaped, it's kind of like an L from our angle. So there were two people right in front of us with their backs to us, and then everyone else was lined up along the east side of the bar. So their backs were facing out east, but we could see their right side of all their persons, and almost everybody at the bar, obviously they saw police officers enter the establishment, so they all turned and looked at us. They were just curious why we were there.
Okay. What were they eating?
I only saw approximately one or two people at the bar eating. Everyone at the bar, though, was drinking. And then there's that table in the back that was eating and drinking.
Okay. What were they drinking?
Is there a point to this line of questioning, Mr. DeVore? I mean, other than to test our officers' knowledge of that particular incident? I'm not sure how this has anything to do with the central issue. If there were people there eating, you're stipulating the facts. Am I missing something?
Well,
I know you're trying to earn your pay here, but I mean, what relevance is this to the broader issue?
Well, this is a quasi-judicial hearing, Mr. Mayor, and I've never had the trier of fact object to the line of questioning when the attorney on the other side is not objecting. It's absolutely relevant.
I'm asking you a question. Is there a point to this? What's the point? I mean, it seems like you're wasting all of our time, Mr. DeVore. I'm sorry, but it seems like you're absolutely totally wasting our time with this line of questioning. I mean, I know you're going to get extra pay from the people that have hired you, but I mean, what's the point? Can you tell me where you're going with this?
Are you just going to go ahead and rule without me letting my clients have due process?
No, this has nothing to do with ruling. It has to do with the facts. What is relevant about where the bar is and what they were eating? I mean, what is this? I mean, I'm not an attorney, so I don't understand why it is that you're nitpicking silly little things like this, which have nothing to do with the broader question. You at least in your opening statement had said something that had to do with this decision. But badgering our office or talking about silly little things like this, and it's just, I'm sorry, but it seems very disrespectful of our officer to say things. Do you just remember this, or is this? I mean, come on. If they were serving, they were serving. What's the point, Mr. DeVore?
Are you telling me I can't ask any more questions, Mr. Mayor?
You're putting words in my mouth, and you're very good at that. But no. I'm asking you, what's the point? You're wasting our time, Mr. DeVore. I know you're pumping up your bill, but what's the point, Mr. DeVore?
I'd like the record to reflect that the trier of fact and the decision maker of this case is interfering with my questioning.
That's very good. I'm sure anybody who saw the questions you had would understand my frustrations. Any reasonable person. Go ahead, Mr. You have other questions. Go ahead. I'm not sure what relevance they have, but go ahead.
Okay. Sir, what were they drinking?
I don't recall exactly, but I saw at least beer.
That I will object to, because we're talking about on-premises consumption. So whether what they were consuming would be totally irrelevant.
Okay.
Mr. DeVore, I was going to say, I had not objected previously because I thought you were trying to get into something about the nature and the scope.
Whoa.
Mr. DeVore.
One person at a time.
Mr. needs to rule on the objection first.
Okay.
So let's
Angela, go ahead.
Can I respond to the objection?
Whoa, Angela, we can't even hear the objection if you just be quiet for a minute, Mr. DeVore.
He objected.
Whoa, Angela, go ahead. What do I need to rule on?
Okay. Mr. Boyle's presented you with an objection. And honestly, at this point, I can't even remember what he objected to.
Okay, let me go back to Mr. Boyle. What did you object to?
Well-
Obviously, we got to have some degree of decorum.
Okay.
If we're at this point of trivial things that apparently we don't have objection to, if we're fighting over this is not a good sign. And we're not going down this path, Mr. DeVore. I don't care what your reputation is or what other things you may have done. This is not happening here. Mr. Boyle, what are you objecting to so I can rule on that before we go forward?
The objection was to the relevance of the question as to what was being consumed. This is about an alleged violation of the prohibition on consumption on premises.
Right.
So what they were consuming, I am saying, is irrelevant.
Mr. DeVore, do you have a response to that? Mr.
I do have a response. If we have a stipulation, Mr. Mayor, as being proffered by my colleague, that what they were consuming is irrelevant, then I withdraw the question and I'll move on.
Okay, thank you very much. Angela, advice to me?
You can go ahead and you can have Mr. DeVore move on.
Mr. DeVore, go ahead and move on with your question.
I have no further questions now with that stipulation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Boyle, any redirect?
No.
George? Sorry.
No, nothing further.
Okay, any other question? Okay, so thank you, officer. We appreciate your help at this point. Mr. Boyle, any further evidence that you want to present?
Nothing further.
Thank you, officer.
Anything else, Mr. Boyle?
Nothing further, would reserve for rebuttal.
Okay, thank you. Mr. DeVore, your turn.
I'd have nothing left but argument given that stipulation, sir.
Okay, at this point, we'll move to, excuse me, do we have people who wanted to testify, Madam Clerk?
Who's calling them?
As I understand, do you have no one, Mr. DeVore, on your end? We have people who called in.
No.
Mr. DeVore, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, sir. No, sir, I do not. Given the stipulation, I don't have any witnesses to call.
Okay, thank you. At this point, though, we do have Mr. DeVore. I'm assuming that if you don't have any.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Boyle, go ahead.
I guess my question on this is, the only relevance would be if they're in a bar and they're drinking. Is he saying that the question that he wants an answer to was whether they were consuming alcohol, or what is that? I'm not understanding what is.
We've moved on. I'm ready for closing argument.
All right, that's fine.
Okay, it sounds like we've moved on. Okay,
all right.
And that's okay. So at this point, we're Angela, anything else before? No, we do have Angela, if I could, just to clarify, and for Madam Clerk, we do have some people who want to testify, I understand, in favor of Joe's Pub, or to be sworn in and to make comments on that. I'm assuming under the circumstances that we allow them, but they can be cross-examined. Is that correct?
No.
At this particular juncture, neither council have called any witnesses, so.
But we do have people who called in who I think are waiting on the line to speak. Is that not appropriate?
What I would do is have council make their closing arguments, and then after closing arguments are made, they can, if they're just stating their opinion via public comment on the particular hearing, that's what would happen. And there would be no line of questioning from either council.
Unless,
in particular, unless they're bringing testimony on the case, then there could be questioning from both council on it. But I don't know who the parties are that called in, because I've got several people here.
Sure, Mr. DeVore, yeah. You wanted to say something, Mr. DeVore?
Thank you, Mayor. Angela, I just want to clarify, if once we give closing argument, if the mayor wants to let those folks say anything, that's not going to be part of the formal record for appeal, correct?
On this individual, so I have a Joe War. So on my screen, I only have, I believe, 2 owners, Anthony Wargo or Joe Wargo. Who are the people that are calling in?
I have 3. Yes, I have 3 people on the line who registered as witnesses for the case for Joe's. 2 of those people spoke a little bit earlier because they registered for general public comment and for the Joe's item.
Okay.
For registration, it did state on there that if you're registering for Joe's, that it was for witness testimony only.
Okay.
May I
if
make
they're
a
up there for public
suggestion?
comment to be part of the appeal, they'd have to, so they're not going to be using them as witnesses, right, Mr. DeVore?
Mr. DeVore?
Not.
Okay.
May
right.
I make a suggestion?
Mr. Boyle, go ahead, and then we'll ask Mr. DeVore if he has any objections. Go ahead.
Well, generally speaking, liquor hearings have a fact-finding phase, and then they have a sentencing phase. I think if the witnesses, and perhaps, I don't, if Mr. DeVore can find a way, or perhaps he already knows who his fact witnesses are, he could present their evidence. I would suggest then, if there's a fact finding in the city's favor, that we proceed to hear those who wish to testify with respect to either the sentencing or make any arguments. And I think it would be best for the attorneys, not to disagree with Ms. Fines-Jimenez, but it may be best to have the attorneys do closing arguments last so that they can reference any of the testimony that may be pertinent.
Mr. DeVore seems to disagree. Mr. DeVore, go ahead.
Sir, I mean, the facts that are going to be considered by you when you make your findings of fact, regardless of how you choose to order, those have to come from the testimony that was adduced by either, we're only going to have one fact witness. So to allow people who want to speak, I'm not calling them witnesses on behalf of my but that could be in any part.
Mr. DeVore, I'm sorry, I can't hear you, sir. Mr. DeVore, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
I'm going to move.
Whoa, Mr. DeVore. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Oh, I can hear you. Okay, go ahead, Mr. DeVore.
I moved closer to the internet, sir.
Okay, cool.
Okay. What I was saying, Mr. Mayor, is that these people who want to testify or talk to you or say whatever they want to say, I don't want that to be in any part of the record that is going to have to be prepared for any potential appeal by either side. So if they want to tell you what they think, that's fine, but I just don't want it to be a part of the witness testimony that you might consider in your findings of fact.
I totally agree with you, Mr. DeVore.
Yeah,
Mayor.
Whoa. Angela first, and then George. Angela.
Because they weren't called as witnesses for either side, I would agree with counsel that you're going to just go through the arguments, and they weren't called as witnesses, so therefore they would not be allowed to.
Before the closing arguments, Mr. Boyle, what would you want to say? I'm sorry.
I'm essentially agreeing with, I think, Mr. DeVore's point, and with Ms. Fines-Jimenez in this respect. The parties to this are the establishment and the city. So it's different in a way than when we have a general kind of public hearing where people can just show up and sound off. That's called, that's the general comment. But the facts and the law that are relevant are between the parties. And so it's it could possibly do either side a disservice to have witnesses just be able to chime in on their behalf.
I think we're all in agreement here. I see Mr. DeVore nodding.
Yes, sir.
That will happen. If anybody still is online and they want to make a statement, that's fine. But they do understand that I'm, as mayor, liquor commissioner, I would turn to my assistant, liquor commissioner, Mr. Jordan, for advice. But basically, I'm going to listen to the arguments, evidence of Mr. Boyle and Mr. DeVore, and we can hear other people if they want to make comments. That's fine, of course. But I'm glad that at least Mr. DeVore agree on this. But go ahead, Mr. DeVore, go ahead.
I think we agree on that, sir.
Good. So if we agree, we are good. If we can agree on something, we are good. Okay.
Yes.
So at this point, we are going to move to closing arguments, and I'm going to start with Mr. Boyle and then Mr. DeVore.
Thank you.
Mr. Boyle. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hold on a second.
Our court reporter can't hear.
Okay, thank you, Mayor.
Can you hear now, court reporter? Thank you. Okay, thank you. Obviously, we all want, I think we can agree on that, an accurate record of everything. Thank you. Mr. Boyle.
Thank you, Mayor. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We have over 14,000 Illinoisans who've died. The public guidance, the health guidance that's cited repeatedly in executive orders 69, 71, 73, and 74, all of which pertain to on-premises indoor consumption. Talk about a horrendous public health emergency. During that public health emergency, the governor is given the power to make numerous types of orders in order to address the pandemic. As I said before, it's clear in Section 7 of the Illinois Emergency Management Act that units of government are to put their resources at the governor's disposal with respect to that. I'm talking about Section 2. It's clear that the governor can regulate businesses and can regulate the sale of alcohol. The reason that we talked about a particular what these people were consuming being irrelevant is that on-door in-premises consumption was prohibited at bars and restaurants. The licensee is a bar. The way this ties in with the city is that the city's liquor commission is under an obligation to cite licensees who do not comply with relevant health and safety regulations. Mr. DeVore has said that only public health can pass regulations. That's not accurate. I mean, public, with respect to regulations, the word regulations refers to a code, regulation, or order involving either the management or the government or the public. And that includes orders. There are public health regulations, and that is certainly one way that things are dealt with in a pandemic. But the other way, quite clearly, and the Foxfire Court stated this very clearly, as did the court in a case called Orland Park versus Pritzker. The governor has the authority to act in a pandemic situation. Mr. DeVore had said Foxfire was irrelevant, but it's not irrelevant. He and others had been making the argument that these executive orders expired after 30 days. The courts have said that's inaccurate. It's a misstatement of the law. I submit once again, we're hearing misstatements of the law. Also, just as background, there have been over 6 businesses now that have agreed with these regulations, have agreed to comply with them.
Sector relevance, that's not relevant.
Well, there was an argument made, I'm saying this because there was an argument made that we're treating businesses differently and that
you'll have your chance, Mr. DeVore. I'm sorry, Mr. Boyle.
That we're treating businesses differently, and that with regard to there being some kind of level playing field, that we're going after businesses, that we're using this, I think the term was called a ruse, that we're treating people unfairly. But we've gotten numerous complaints, and one of them is in our evidence, I believe it's 10, from the public that talk about, some of them business people, the one in Exhibit 10 being a medical professional, but others that are worried about what will happen if businesses are just allowed to ignore the orders and to remain open, and that want there to be a level playing field. Numerous businesses have contacted me and said, we have to close. We get sanctioned if we're closed. Why, or not closed, because I'm talking, we still have, carry out, we still have outdoor consumption to the extent it can be done. But they say we're not allowed to have on-premises indoor consumption. What makes this place so special? Why do they get to do it? And so It's not a matter of being unfair. It's a matter of being fair. It's a matter of addressing the pandemic through cooperation and collaboration that emphasizes our interdependence, and it makes a level playing field for these businesses. We've been told, well, they will, that there are a lot of them that are having economic problems, and that's very sympathetic. There's a balance that has to be struck between the public health emergencies, requirements, things that need to be done to remedy that, and the business community, and the economic health of the community. But that balance is struck in the middle of a pandemic, is struck by the executive charged by the Illinois Emergency Management Act with dealing with public health issues. And we are charged to enforce those regulations. One other thing is there was a statement made, and I, for what it's worth, I object to this idea, the words ruse and the very others pejoratives used. I think people of good faith often can differ, especially given these times now where there's a lot of changes occurring and there's a lot of tension, a lot of fear about safety and about economic well-being. One other thought and thing I'd like to address with this argument was that Mr. DeVore had stated that there were no other cities that had enforced liquor regulations of this type. My understanding is that Decatur has done so. My understanding is that Champaign actually closed the business for not complying with Illinois Department of Public Health rules, closed them for 7 days. So those are two that come readily to mind. There may be others, but I want to be clear before I would make statements about that. And I know that that's of tangential relevance, but it was addressed earlier. So with that in mind, that's the end of our argument. We think that there should be a finding in favor of the city.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Boyle. Mr. DeVore, your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Excuse me, I just wanted to reserve for rebuttal, and also if we get to sentencing, describing our fine and other system, and to make a recommendation.
Excuse me, before I do that, Angela, is there there's no issue if Mr. Boyle wants to respond to Mr. DeVore, then obviously Mr. DeVore needs to be able to respond to Mr. Boyle at the end. Is that correct?
No, typically what would happen is that the city would present at its closing, then the respondent would present their opinion in response to said closing, and then the city would get a rebuttal. Then you would make a decision. At that particular time, there would be a sentencing aspect where Mr. Boyle can make a recommendation, and Mr. DeVore can also, make his own recommendation as to what sentencing, if there's any imposed, and then you make a ruling on that.
That's right.
Okay, thank you. At this point, we're going to do step by step. We're going to Mr. DeVore, and then we'll see if there are any rebuttals to the rebuttals, the closing argument. Mr. DeVore, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A couple of things I want to point out before I get to the crux of it, with Mr. Boyle points out. There's no suggestion at any point in time that there's no one acting in bad faith. People in good faith can create a ruse if they feel it's necessary. So when I use the word ruse, I'm not suggesting any nefarious acts. But that is what we have here, and I'll get to why. As far as bringing up the city of Decatur and the city of Champaign, guess what? I represent all those people too. City of Decatur's liquor ordinance is not the same as the city of Bloomington's liquor ordinance. And we are here talking about your liquor ordinance, not the city of Decatur. In Champaign, that's a food permit issue. Got nothing to do with liquor license. Now, having said that, there has been an acknowledgement in this hearing and a stipulation that these measures being levied against my clients has nothing to do with the regulation of liquor. There was a stipulation, we don't care what they're drinking. So if this committee is going to seriously sit here today and say that this is not a ruse, and it's not even a question, but I'm making the record clear, but we're going to talk about penalizing a liquor licensee for something that has nothing to do with liquor consumption. Be the first time in history. Now, your ordinance is what matters. You are here today to try to enforce your ordinance, not the governor's executive order. Whether or not he can issue an order for 30 days or 60 days or 90 or what are we now? Like, we'll be 5 years before he decides to release us. But that's not even the issue, sir. The issue is your liquor ordinance. And it says, under Section 3, which you allege my client potentially violated, permitting any violation of the state law or a Bloomington City code. I don't think anybody's suggesting that the governor's executive order is a state law, because if it is, we'll just dismantle the state legislature. We don't need them anymore. Number 4, failure to maintain the licensed premises in compliance with all codes and regulations pertaining to the health and safety applicable within the city. And it talks about all different types of those regulations. That's the standard, sir, that you have to apply it to. Is this licensee, in some fashion, even though liquor's got nothing to do with it, that's a precarious hurdle for you to accomplish, sir. Are they violating a regulation? I mean, we've hung it up on regulation, not really on code. Mr. Boyle talks about the governor's guidance. Okay, guidance, what is guidance? It's in writes executive orders. Is an executive order a regulation that can be enforced under your liquor license? That is the question that's going to be answered by you. And that's going to be a question in some fashion that's going to get answered at a lot of different places in this state and this country. Is an executive order a regulation of a health and safety nature that can be enforced by you through your liquor ordinance? That's the question. It doesn't matter what the nature of this pandemic is, whether it's the coronavirus. The governor could issue an executive order for a variety of reasons. We just happen to be talking about the coronavirus today. You got to set the coronavirus aside and say, do I have the authority under law to enforce an executive order through calling it a regulation of a health and safety nature? That has nothing to do with alcohol, again, by the way. I'll keep pointing that out. And I've pointed out what a regulation is from health and safety. They're promulgated by the Illinois Department of Public Health through the JCAR rulemaking process. We don't have that here. We got, again, an executive order. Before I get to the executive order, I want to talk about the lack of jurisdiction that you have on this issue. Because what is it that you are trying to accomplish? That's where you have to start. That's to keep people out of the inside of this building. There's an acknowledgement. When they drinking alcohol, not drinking alcohol, we don't care. They're in there and they're consuming something. And that is a bad thing because we're trying to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. We all know that's what's going on. There's no secret. Illinois law 20 ILCS 2305, section 2B says that if you're trying to prevent the spread of a virus and you want to make somebody's premises off limits for any reason, consuming food or beverage, whatever it is, you have to follow the state law and the state regulations. Those regulations say you have to prove by clear and convincing evidence that there is something going on inside that building that you have to shut it down for some amount of time. That's why your health department's not taking action against my client. There's no facts that they have that going on. That's the jurisdictional requirements that have to be met, and you can't take that jurisdiction away from them. That's this argument. The second is, let's set that aside. Set that aside and say, well, we think we still can. We think that the governor's his power can be bootstrapped on through our liquor ordinance to accomplish this task. Your regulation, when we come back to it, or your ordinance says regulation. Regulation is a defined term, as I've said. Set that aside. If you go to the Emergency Management Agency Act, as I pointed out to you at the beginning, Mr. Mayor, the governor in some fashion can make regulations within his authority of this law. He has that. He's never made one, ever made a regulation since March 9th. Never happened. He's passed some executive orders. We don't even have to talk about them because it's quite simple. An order is not a regulation. There's specifically different things under the law. The governor, under Section 18 of the Emergency Management Act, has to file those rules, regulations, or orders. Mr. Mayor, there are three different things. He has to file those with the Secretary of State's office before it even becomes effective. So every time he's passed an executive order in the state of Illinois, procedurally, he files it with the Secretary of State. Every order he's ever passed, regardless of whether it has any power, it should have lasted 30 days, don't care. He's filed them all. He has never filed a regulation of any sort with the Secretary of State as it relates to this types of matters. Section B is even more precarious for this governing body, because if the governor had actually created a regulation, and if the governor had recorded it with the Secretary of State, who can enforce that regulation of his? Your governing body cannot under the law. Every emergency service and disaster agency established pursuant to this act shall execute and enforce the governor's orders, rules, and regulations. Section 18B. Your governing body is not an agency that was established under this act. I understand, sir, the goal that you want to accomplish. I perfectly understand it. And I'm not here to sit and talk with you about whether that's good, whether that's bad, what impact that has, etc. That's not my job. My job, which is dealing with the law, whether or not the law as established by the state of Illinois and the laws established within your ordinances give you the authority to do what you're trying to do. And it does not. The best intentions don't matter. It does not allow that. The jurisdiction for these reasons of what you're trying to accomplish lie with the Department of Health. And it is not a regulation of any sort, the governor's executive order. And even if he had passed a regulation, you could not enforce it anyway. Those are hurdles that you cannot overcome, no matter how bad you think that these businesses need to not have people inside to protect the people in your city. There are bigger issues at play right now than a coronavirus, sir. And that's the issue of disregarding the law in order to try to accomplish a mean that you may think is worthy. And I'm asking you not to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeVore. Mr. Boyle?
First of all, addressing council's maintaining that the fact that you can only cite licensees for things that involve alcohol is inaccurate. 37 of our code, section 37 of our code has numerous things that licensees can be cited for, including the health regulations, and we'll get to that in a minute. But also payment failure to pay taxes, allowing of crimes, various other kinds of illegal gambling operations, other kinds of things that licensees can be cited for. So to maintain the licensees that they had to be consuming alcohol in order for this to be a valid liquor license citation is inaccurate. The reason that the stipulation could be made and not involve what they were drinking is that the executive orders pertain to on-premises indoor consumption. It doesn't specify alcohol, but in the bar context, in the liquor license context, probably was alcohol, but if it was in premises, And if it was consumption, then it involves enforcement of the executive orders. And those orders are valid regulations. If you look in Black's Law Dictionary, you'll see that orders are included in a definition of regulations. And when it comes to statutory construction, you go to the plain meaning of the statute, and you go also to the plain English words, unless there's a specific definition in the statute. There are pertinent health regulations as to how buildings can be quarantined. There is a way for that to occur, but it's not the only way for it to occur. The executive orders are solidly grounded in the Emergency Management Act, and our ability to enforce them as valid health and safety regulations. And I'd ask the commission to look at the beginnings of these orders and see the rationale behind them, the hundreds of thousands of cases, the public health emergency existing, and the idea that given the nature and the scope of the growth of the pandemic, that keeping people from different households away from each other, and this is specified in the executive orders, is science that is directly focused on accomplishing the public good. And that's one of the things that our ordinance is focused at when it requires licensees to comply with public health and safety regulations. There is an old case from 1922 that was cited, that I'd like to cite, called Barmore versus Roberts, that was cited as dicta in the Foxfire case. It says that the wisdom of health regulations is not necessarily what courts look into, provided that there is a rational basis, that they're not arbitrary. This is not arbitrary. This is necessity, excuse me. And it's firmly grounded in science. And that is specified in the beginning of these executive orders that are contained in our exhibits. Nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. Mr. DeVore, your turn.
Just briefly, sir, again, I wouldn't have except for that last part that went outside kind of the reply part and kind of created a new argument. So I find it interesting. And if you, again, regardless of how you choose, if you really want to appreciate this, Mr. Mayor, go read the Barmore v. Roberts case. You know who started using that case? Me, months ago. And do you know what that case is about? It's about the health department's authority to deal with these types of things. And you know what the Supreme Court of the state of Illinois said? It said two things that I think would be of interest to you in this case. One is that it's dangerous to put health and safety regulations in the hands of one man. And it says those things are left to boards and groups of people so you don't have arbitrary and capricious action. Apply that to what we're talking about today. The second thing that Barmore says is that health regulations that merely tend to prevent the spread of a disease are unconstitutional. Apply that to these facts we have today. So I know that Barmore gets off the pace a little bit, but that case clearly stands for the proposition that you don't let one man or woman, I'm using man in its generic sense, create health and safety regulations. That's why we have boards. The term board of health, that's a real term. So that's all I got to say, sir.
Thank you, Mr. DeVore.
Yes, sir.
Anything else, either Mr. Boyle or Mr. DeVore?
Just to respond on the Barmore case, that predates the provisions of the act. So I'm not sure that it would be relevant in that regard. No, hold on, let me finish.
Yeah.
Let me finish. I don't think it would be relevant in the regard that it has to do with one person. It has to do with court review of a particular set of regulations. So I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know that it would be relevant in the way that Mr. DeVore is arguing, but I think it is relevant to this idea about second guessing health
Okay.
regulations.
Mr. DeVore, response?
I would tend to agree with that general legal profit, what he proffers, if we were dealing with health regulations that are promulgated through the public process that has legislative involvement. Court gives deference to those. That's true. And that's what was going on in that case. That's not the same thing as that deferential nature of regulations should not be used to suspect that you should give deference to that, because again, that's not really the issue in front of you, sir. The issue in front of you is whether your liquor ordinance gives you the ability to do what you're doing. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. DeVore. I'm going to talk to Angela. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I just want, as we have had these situations in the past, pre-COVID, which of course had nothing to do with the kinds of issues that we're dealing with now, I would confer with my liquor commissioners in my office, and then I'd come back and issue a decision. How would I handle that currently to get Commissioner Jordan's confidential thoughts?
If the city clerk, the deputy clerk has a breakout room, well, you can talk about it. Do you have concerns that you need to present to Commissioner Jordan?
I just want to get Commissioner Jordan's perspective, as I have in the past, before rendering a decision. Mr. DeVore has a question. Mr. DeVore.
I was just going to say in that if you feel the need to do that, sir, technically under the provisions we're operating under, you have 5 days to render a decision. So.
I understand. Thank you, Mr. I appreciate that. I just wanted to get, and I appreciate that. I just wanted to, as in the past, when we had situations, I wanted to at least get the, even if it's a very quick opinion, get the perspective of my liquor commissioner or commissioners, if they're present, before rendering a decision.
I have no objection to you doing that in however fashion you have to do it, sir. I mean, we can go mute, we can disconnect and come back. You guys can, whatever you need to do, sir, I fully respect.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Mr. DeVore, and I appreciate that. Mr. Boyle, do you have any objections to that?
Well, I don't have an objection. I think Mr. Melder, who is our IT person here, is letting us know that a breakout room of the type described is not technically possible. And I appreciate Mr. DeVore's flexibility about it. I too would be flexible about working something out. I'm just saying technically, we're not going to have that breakout room available to us. I think
what I can do is
still checking with him.
Oh, Angela, go ahead.
I would make a recommendation then, if you need to discuss it, is that you could table this, and then you could bring, that gives you the opportunity to talk to
Angela, no, I'm not going to table this. I just want to talk to Jim for a second. Jim, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Angela, is there any problem if I were to just, while we're maybe just recess briefly and just talk to Jim before I render a decision? I would call him. Is there a problem with that, Madam Clerk? Oh, excuse me, Angela?
I do not have a problem, and then you just log back in, I assume, or?
I'm not even thinking of, I would just mute myself and then call Jim. But obviously I do want to make sure that we have anybody who's still on for public comment. So I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I just want to clarify that process. Is that okay, Angela?
I would say that.
Yeah, that seems fine. That's fine. You can just go ahead.
Okay.
Is there a concern that it would need to be recorded, Ms. Fyans? As an executive session?
Oh, I hadn't thought about that.
Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out, if there can't be a breakout.
That could be. That's true. Okay. All right. Well, in the short run, then, while we're thinking this through, is there anyone, Madam Clerk, that's still online who wants to make a comment on this, with the understanding that neither myself nor Commissioner Jordan can really take this information into consiration in rendering a decision?
Your Honor, I think, Mayor, you're going to have to do that after you make your decision.
I'm going to have to do what? I'm sorry.
You can have the public comment after you make your decision on this.
Oh, it has to be after, to be sure.
Correct.
Okay. So I think it is fair to say, like when I would go into executive session, excuse me, when we went back into my office, when we had a couple of liquor commissioners give me their opinion, that that was recorded. So if I call Commissioner Jordan, that's in a sense not recorded, and it could be, yeah, I get that. Okay.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask a question, sir?
Of course you can, Mr. DeVore.
Are you going to actually overtly express your decision here, or are you going to just reduce it to the written order that we have to get and submit that to us, or both?
My intention was, as I have always in the past, in any kind of situation, is to try to give some finality so that the litigants that are, or participants that are in the meeting understand what's happened, so that they can, or their legal counsel, you in your case, Mr. DeVore, if there are any questions about any fine or any other penalties or whatever it might be, that they could ask those at that time. Angela, I'm going to go back to you. I'm putting you in an impossible situation. I understand that. Anything that you can give me in terms of any advice at this point? So I really can't call Jim, because
Right.
that's a problem. Is there? Can I ask Jim anything he would be willing to say while we're in this meeting, even if it might be putting him in an uncomfortable situation?
If Commissioner Jordan wants to talk openly about the particular case in front of all to hear, he can respond in that fashion. You can also table it and go to another meeting. You can also take it under advisement, and you can either sustain or not sustain the complaint, and then at a separate time do a separate hearing on sentencing. There's several different avenues.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's very clear. I'm going to ask Jim if there's anything at this point that you would feel comfortable in saying in terms of your observation. Obviously, Mr. Jordan has been involved in law enforcement as a police officer in other ways for a very long time. That's one of the reasons why, in fact, that's the primary reason why he's on the Liquor Commission. Mr. Jordan, any comments?
Well, I think, Mayor, it comes down to the reality that the state of Illinois issues a state of Illinois liquor license, and then they leave it up to the local authorities, which would be the local liquor commission, to set forth the rules and regulations that they want to live under. But this gets into such a, I guess, it doesn't spell out, because one community, say you mentioned Champaign or Decatur, might have a different ordinance pertaining to different issues, and Bloomington may have another ordinance, and even Normal, which would be a sister city, I think they operate on a different principle than we do. So it's hard to define one versus the other. You just have to take with what you have, which is you have to ask the legal counsel how they see this, and is the compliance in accordance with the way the legal counsel interprets the law. And that said, I think you have to live with whatever decision he renders concerning this particular issue.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Jordan. I very much appreciate that. Angela, at this point, would I ask, in terms of, I would I would make a decision on the complaint, which would be separate from the fine, correct?
So you'd make a correct. You'd make a decision on the complaint, and then either today or at a later date, you can ask the city their perspective if you find in favor of the complaint, what the recommendation is, and then Mr. Council DeVore would be able to make his recommendation if you find in favor of the complaint.
In terms of whatever the size of the fine or complaint
or suspension
would be. Okay.
Correct.
Okay. I appreciate that. And as I've said before, when we've had these liquor commission meetings, nobody wants to be here, right? None of us want to be in this situation. And nobody, I mean, unless you're somebody's had a frontal lobotomy, you're not a mayor who wants to have small businesses struggling to go under, or have people who live paycheck to paycheck not being able to make ends meet. Obviously, that's the case. And I wouldn't want to be governor of this or any state under circumstances like this. But if you're mayor, you got to look people in the eye who are living paycheck to paycheck, whose small businesses are struggling. Of course, this is a terrible situation. And the vaccine, frankly, can't come fast enough from my perspective. Because in most of the time we spent trying to promote businesses to try to get us further, to have more jobs. So this is not a fun thing, to say the least. I'm sure for any of us here. But at the end of the day, I do understand that there are structural issues, and I've criticized them myself, with how the health department has authority to deal with things that, at least in McLean County, they're not dealing with. And I think the reason why they're not dealing with it is because of a particular interpretation of the state's attorney's office. That does create inequities, where you can go into, as someone mentioned in public comment, a Denny's, but not a Joe's Pub. And the city has no authority to deal with establishments like Denny's that don't have a liquor license, but do have authority to deal with establishments like Joe's Pub. It's terrible inequity. There's no question about that. I don't know how anybody could come to any other conclusion. But it also is, I think, quite clear to me from everything I've heard and seen, and dealing with people at the Illinois Municipal League and some of the other issues, but certainly the evidence as presented here, that we do have to protect public safety in the ways that are directed. And so I do find, pursuant to the evidence that was presented by our police officer, that there was a violation of the governor's order. That seems to be clear. We can have disputes as to whether it's a regulation or whatever. I'm not going down that path. I don't need to make this decision. I don't believe. I do think it's a regulation. I'm not sure. I'm not going down that path. I do find, based on the evidence that I see here, that there is a violation. And I do want to listen to the arguments or the position of Mr. Boyle and Mr. DeVore about what that fine would be. I don't think we're talking about a first situation here. We are not. I think Mr. DeVore a couple of times had talked about a licensing here. This is not a question as to whether I would consider suspending somebody's liquor license. This is the first time. It's not a question, obviously, of revocation or something that extreme. So if we're not even talking about suspension, we're talking about a fine. And the fines, as we know, any monies that are collected from the fines are going to be put into a separate fund to help people who are the most in need right now, having the greatest difficulties. Not that the people, Mr. and Mr. Wargo who are doing this, I can't even imagine the kinds of difficulties that they're facing. And I can give no comfort in going down that path. But I'm going to ask very briefly Mr. Boyle and then Mr. DeVore, are there recommendations for fines under the circumstances? And if you would specify why, given that we want to treat equals equally and unequals unequally, so that we're as fair as we possibly can be. Mr. Boyle. Mr. George, we can't hear you. George?
Okay, yep.
Oh, okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mayor. Our ordinance provides for fines from $250 to $3,500. I agree that this is a first offense. And with that in mind, we would recommend a fine of $600 and ask that it be paid by a date certain, and suggest that it be paid by the 22nd of December, so 7 days.
22nd of December, that's what your recommendation is, and a fine of $600. Mr. DeVore.
As far as before the fine, again, just to clarify, Mr. Mayor,
Sure, of course.
Your ruling will be reduced to writing, stating these reasons and provided to us. Is that correct, sir?
I'm sorry, Mr. DeVore, reduced to writing? I'm sorry?
Yeah, the statute requires you to issue a written order stating reasons and findings, et cetera.
Of course.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I just want to make sure that we'll be getting that here pretty soon is all, sir.
Of course. And if you don't, you let us know.
I think it says within 5 days. I apologize again, sir.
Okay, so just to correct, Mr. DeVore, so we would, as your understanding is that we would give you a written notice for you or your clients within 5 days, regardless of when the fine is due.
Yes, I mean, I think if you talk to Angela and George, but the statute requires you issue a written order within 5 days of the hearing. Even though we can't know what it is, I need that written order so I can advise my client, sir. That's all.
Of course, sir. Of course.
So, Angela.
Angela, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, actually, Angela, I really need to turn to you rather than George because of the roles here. Angela?
Right, yeah, you would need to reduce it to writing and send out an order to both parties, being both Counsel Boyle and Counsel DeVore, as to your ruling and to any sentencing. And at that point, either party can take steps on the order if they don't agree with the amount of sentencing or if they don't agree with the ruling.
Correct. Okay.
Well, I will accept Mr. Boyle's recommendation of a $600 fine. Now, Mr. Boyle, I'm sorry.
Didn't get a chance to.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, Mr. DeVore, I apologize. Okay, I did not see your hand up. Mr. DeVore, go ahead. Before I go further, Mr. DeVore.
That's okay, sir. I heard the reasoning that you're given, and I can fully appreciate, Mr. Mayor, I do appreciate what you're trying to accomplish. And we can have gentlemen's disagreements all day long about the efficacy of the methods being taken by the city. But I'm asking you to consider what's worse, dealing with a pandemic or, and again, I say this respectfully, creating rules and rules to try to force compliance with something like this. It's a precarious situation, sir. Now, as far as your fine structure and your ordinance, again, I don't think the max is relevant. The statute says no more than $1,000. Some point in time, you may want to look at your ordinance. The max on first offense is capped at $1,000 under state law. Minimum of yours is $250. I think the minimum fine under these circumstances, $250, is appropriate. Because again, I'm not sure who you're giving that money to, but there's going to be, if this continues down this path, these businesses are suffering in general and the people that work for them. So, I think that the monetary fine is the, least significant part of this thing. And I would ask you to do the minimum. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And that is something, Mr. DeVore, I would not disagree with you on at all. The monetary fine is the least important thing that we're dealing with right now, to say the least. At this point, Mr. Boyle, I have one question. Why the 7-day period for having this fine due? George, we can't hear you.
I suggested a date certain so that you could tell whether the order was complied with. Certainly, you could go further back if you approve, given what Mr. DeVore has requested. And of course, we are obligated to provide him this, the commission at least is obligated to provide him with a written ruling. You may choose to, to go further back and allow more time. I just was suggesting that whatever the order says with respect to a fine, that there be a date certain in there so there can be some yardstick as to compliance.
Okay. Well, and it seems, so the date that you were recommending was what date? I'm sorry, Mr. Boyle?
December 22nd.
Okay.
It's not only a yardstick for compliance, it's also giving some guidance to the, licensee as to what they're expected to do.
Mr. DeVore, you had your hand up. Mr.
Could
DeVore.
I make a recommendation, sir, as to that, regardless of the monetary fine?
Sure.
Just under the premise, sir, that you would take the 5 days to issue the written finding, and once we actually have that in writing, then I can talk to my clients and advise them of their options. could you make any potential fine amount due based upon that 5 days? So maybe 7 days or something after that. That way I have adequate time to discuss with them their options from the time you've issued the opinion, sir.
Mr. DeVore, I'm more than willing to do that. In fact, let's make it January 10th, 2021.
Yes, sir.
We have a $600 fine.
Yes, sir.
January 10th, 2021. That should give you plenty of time to talk with your clients. And obviously we're dealing with the holidays and other issues. If you decide to appeal or other issues that you decide, that should give you, I would assume, is that fair? At least, I know you're not in agreement with the amount, but is the date fair to you?
That procedural structure makes sense to me, sir. Yes, sir.
Again, obviously we want to make sure that there's plenty of time, and we want, I'm not even sure, I never even asked either Mr. Wargo, who Joe's Pub is named after, because apparently, oh, it's Joe. Oh, shoot, Joe. Oh man, am I an idiot? I didn't realize your name was Joe. Okay. I apologize for that. Okay. So obviously we want Joe's Pub to succeed. We want the people who are working with Joe's to be able to go to work. We are facing a very, very serious situation here, and whether or not this is the best way to handle it is only my call right here. So I obviously wish the Wargos and Joe's Pub the best, and I hope that time frame is sufficient to at least enable you to deal with your clients. Excuse me, Mr. DeVore, did you have something else?
I just said thank you for your time, sir. I apologize.
Sure. No, of course. Angela, anything else I should be doing at this point? Are we ready to adjourn?
Your Honor, I keep saying Your Honor, I'm used to that.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm just glad when people don't call me jackass.
And would not be doing that.
Not yet.
Do we have anyone else that's here for public comment on this particular case?
That's right. Madam Clerk, is there anyone else is anyone still on the line after this almost 2-hour hearing?
Yes, we have one person left on the line.
And who's that?
Mr. Nicholas Fitzgerald.
Mr. Fitzgerald, can you hear us?
Hey, evening. How are you, Mr. Inner?
Thank you. Thanks for staying on the line. And
yeah, it's been interesting.
I bet it is. You have up to 3 minutes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll shorten up a lot of the points I had been mentioned here. So bottom line, I just want to say, we lived outside of town. We've just recently got back in town. When my wife, friends, customers, and family go to either of Joe's restaurants, I know speaking on Station House as well, we do always feel welcome and safe. I know the Wargos. I know the respect for Bloomington Normal. Its well-being, value to community through donations and local charities. Joe and Tony on local young athletics, their passion for good food and good service. And just want to say that my circle and I, we frequented their establishment since I've been here, and I hope we can continue to frequent there after this pandemic's all over. One thing I'll ask, as my father always told me, offer a viable solution if disagree with something and want change. So the one thing I wanted to ask, we were kind of kicking around at work today. We work on the south side of town. And one thought was maybe signing a liability waiver like you kind of do before you go skiing or something else. You've probably seen for patrons as they enter restaurants. And then, of course, taking the temperatures we've seen in other states earlier this year. So just wanted to ask on those two things. Other than that, just in conclusion, know the vaccine's a stone throws away for the general public in 21, and hopefully you and our leadership can stand up for what's fair so we can soon put all this confusing, seemingly unorganized and unjust rules behind us while thinking about our small town businesses such as Joe's Pub. It really does make Bloomington great, and a reason we have people come from all over the country, and that's where we go for food and for our social scene. And really move together in a positive way for 21. So that's all I really have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzgerald. And I would absolutely echo what you said. And we don't normally comment on public comment, but absolutely, it's institutions and establishments like Joe's Pub that are absolutely critical. And it's definitely the kind of establishment I always like to frequent. I figured I'm probably not allowed in there, so that's one of the reasons why I haven't gone. Certainly not in recent months. But Anyway, at this point, can I have a motion to adjourn? Commissioner Jordan, since you're the only one here.
Yes, I'll make a motion. We adjourn the meeting.
I second that. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you so much. And again, we really do hope the best that we can get through all of this. And I thank all of you, Mr. DeVore and Mr. Boyle and Ms. Angela Finez Jimenez, for all of your work in all of this. And officer, thank you. Just to your Arjona, is that correct?
It's Arjona, sir.
Arjona. Okay. Thank you very much. And thanks for staying on the line. And let's hope that we get through this as soon as possible. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you for your service, Officer Jonah. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, officer.
Oh, boy. Goodness sakes.